This is Land of Havilah, Daniel 9c. The angel Gabriel is in the middle of explaining Daniel's vision of the end times. He just said that eventually the Jews in Jerusalem will be reconciled to God, bring in everlasting righteousness, and anoint the most holy. Then he says, verse 25, "Know therefore and discern that from the going out of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem to the Anointed One, the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with street and moat, even in troubled times." Comment in verse 25, a command will go out to restore and build Jerusalem. This turned out to be the command of King Artaxerxes, issued as recorded in Nehemiah 2, 1-8. Jerusalem was in ruins, and the command was specifically that Nehemiah should go to Jerusalem and rebuild the city. In the book of Ezra, Kings Cyrus and Darius issued commands to build the temple, but didn't mention building anything else. So neither one of those commands is the command Gabriel's talking about in verse 25. Artaxerxes issued his command in 445 BC, give or take a year, so we have a pretty firm starting point for the clock of this prophecy to begin ticking. Then in verse 27, there's a period of 7 weeks, which is 49 years. In the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah went to Jerusalem, and once they began work on the wall, they finished it in 52 days. But the prophecy calls for all Jerusalem to be built in 49 years, and it's very reasonable it took 49 years to restore the streets so that everything looked normal. So let's call it a completely accurate prophecy that it took 49 years to build the city. The end point of that prophecy is very fuzzy. What's the end point of building a city? So there's no way to really prove to a skeptic that the 49 years was accurate or inaccurate. And by the way, Nehemiah emphasized how they built the wall in troubled times under the constant threat of violence, Nehemiah 4:17. This agrees with the prophecy of verse 25 that Jerusalem would be built even in troubled times. The establishment of Jerusalem within 49 years will be the fulfillment of Daniel's prayer at the top of the chapter. But the prophecy keeps going to an establishment of Jerusalem beyond what Daniel could ask or think. The second set of years in verse 25 multiplies out to 434. Adding the 49 and 434 together, they're 483. This is when Messiah should come, according to the verse. So doing the arithmetic and starting at 445 BC, which was the command, and adding 483, Messiah should come in 38 AD. But wait, in the transition from 1 BC to 1 AD, there was no 0 year. To account for that, Messiah should come in 39 AD. But wait, the arithmetic we just did is based on the modern calendar. We should do the arithmetic according to the ancient calendar. The length of a year on ancient calendars was consistently 12 months, and a month was 30 days, which would make the year 360 days. A 360-day year would mean Messiah would arrive in 32 AD. The reason for ancient calendars consistently having a 360-day year are as follows. A lunar month is about 29.53059 days, which is much too unwieldy for general purposes. So for practical purposes, ancient calendars rounded the month to 30 days. A solar year is about 365.2422 days, which again is much too unwieldy. So again, to make the calendar accessible and understandable to the public, a year was simply 12 months. 12 months in a year and 30 days in a month makes a 360-day year. The ancient wise men who studied astronomy knew quite well that this didn't quite make a solar year. But what was more important, to keep the calendar precise to the solar year, or to make things accessible and understandable to the king and the public? Besides, it'd be nice to keep the numbers simple for the sake of rapid estimations and calculations, and for the sake of diplomacy and international dealings, foreigners had to be on the same page. Therefore, they kept it simple and rounded the month to 30 days and the year to 12 months. They knew the heavens weren't that simple, but at the same time, there are a lot of very good reasons to make it simple. Sir Isaac Newton said, quote, "All nations, before the just length of the solar year was known, reckoned months by the course of the moon, taking the nearest round numbers, whence came the division of the ecliptic into 360 degrees, end quote. In other words, for purposes of constructing a practical calendar, all the ancient cultures rounded the month to 30 days and the year to 12 months, which makes a year 360 days. The listener might agree that when Columbus arrived in the Americas, for example, if he had asked how long a moon was, they would have told him about 30 days. And if he had asked how long a year was, they would have said about 12 moons. And if he had asked to make an appointment with them several years down the road, the only practical thing for the natives would be to count it out in moons. We said all that to point out that if we use the ancient year of 360 days, the prophecy was exactly accurate. In summary, Artaxerxes issued the order to rebuild Jerusalem in 445 BC, give or take a year. From that year, the prophecy called for 7 sets of 7 years to go by, and Jerusalem would be built, which it was. Then 62 sets of 7 years would go by, which would make 32 AD, and Messiah would arrive. And indeed, 32 AD corresponds to the year of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The least we can say is that 32 AD is within the range we estimate for that event, if not right on it. Of course, Jesus arrived on the earth about 33 years earlier, but his formal arrival in Jerusalem as king, which was the triumphal entry of Matthew 21:5, was about 32 AD. So let's let that sink in how accurate the prophecy was. It was exactly accurate in that it completely agrees with the interval between the range of dates commonly given for Artaxerxes' order and Jesus' triumphal entry, exactly and completely, completely and exactly. And if we knew the dates of Artaxerxes' order and the triumphal entry down to the day and year, your narrator has no doubt the prophecy would be correct to the day. Gabriel goes on, verse 26. After the 62 weeks, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. Comment in verse 26, after 62 weeks, which puts us at the triumphal entry, Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. In fulfillment, a week after the triumphal entry, quote, all the disciples left him, Matthew 26:56. He was crucified, Luke 23:33. At one point he had neither a kingdom nor a single follower, nor life nor breath. He had absolutely nothing, exactly as verse 26 says. Still in verse 26, the people of the prince who come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Comment, we should remember that 3 verses ago, Gabriel said he came to give Daniel a better understanding of the vision, this being the vision Daniel mentioned in verse 21, which was the vision of chapter 8 that the same Gabriel interpreted once before, but after which Daniel still didn't understand. In that vision, a king of fierce face would come. He would destroy awesomely, destroy the mighty ones, and destroy the holy people. He was clearly the Antichrist of the Great Tribulation. So in verse 26, when Gabriel mentions the prince who will come to destroy the city and the sanctuary, he's speaking of that same destroying prince, which is the Antichrist. The context of it absolutely dictates that he's talking about the Antichrist. Now, it's true that in 70 AD the Romans destroyed the temple and largely destroyed the city, and if someone wants to consider that a fulfillment, fine, but the real fulfillment will be by the destroying prince of the last chapter, the Antichrist, the one Daniel is so worried about. He'll destroy the city, which is Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, which is the temple, and he'll destroy the holy people. Still speaking of the city, in verse 26, its end will be with a flood, and war will be even to the end. Desolations are determined. Comment, Jerusalem's end will be with a flood. This is why Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, meaning the temple abomination that the Antichrist will perpetrate, run for your life. There'll be a flood of persecution against Israel at that time. Matthew 24:15-22. Then in verse 27, war will be to the end. Desolations are determined. The Romans desolated Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. Ever since, Gentiles have trampled the city, and there's never been a moment of peace for the Jews there. There's always been war or rumor of war. The temple has never been rebuilt. And since the time Gabriel uttered these words, there was also the desolation of Antiochus Epiphanes. The desolations were all determined, according to verse 26, but with each desolation the end was not yet, Matthew 24:6. Now speaking of the destroying prince, verse 27, he'll make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week he'll cause the sacrifice and the offering to cease. On the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, and even to the full end, and that determined wrath will be poured out on the desolate. Comment in verse 27, the Antichrist will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. The week mentioned in verse 27 brings the prophecy full circle. Gabriel said the prophecy would play out over a period of 490 years, but since he broke the prophecy down into sets, that didn't necessarily mean 490 years straight. The time of Messiah's arrival marked 483 years, which means there would be another set of 7 years. The 7 years begin in verse 27. The Antichrist will make a covenant with many. This is the event that marks the beginning of the 7 years. The end of the 7 years will be the end of the 490 years, and all the events of the prophecy will have come to pass. By then, Daniel's people will have made an end to disobedience and sins. They'll be reconciled to God, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy. But first, in verse 27, the Antichrist will make a covenant with many for 1 week, which means from the time he makes the covenant, he'll be around 7 more years. He won't be around more than that because the Lord Jesus will return and destroy him, Revelation 19:20. Then in verse 27, in the middle of the 7 years, the Antichrist will cause the sacrifice and offering to cease. This means there must be a temple by the middle of the 7 years and the active giving of sacrifices. The cease of the sacrifices will probably coincide exactly with the abomination of desolation the Antichrist will commit at the temple, Matthew 24:15. When the Antichrist commits an abomination there and sets himself up as God there, 2 Thessalonians 2:4, sacrifices to God will be impossible because the place will be desecrated. Starting in the middle of the 7 years, the Antichrist will begin to persecute the Jews horrendously and all the holy people. This will go on for a time, times, and half a time, Daniel 7:25, which is the second half of the 7 years, 3.5 years, until the Lord returns. Daniel's 70th week, which is the last set of 7 years, is one thing, but technically speaking, the Antichrist won't rise up against the holy people until the middle of the week. The middle of the week is the beginning of what Jesus called the Great Tribulation, Matthew 24:15-21. Therefore, some Christians are sticklers for terminology and say the Great Tribulation isn't 7 years, but only the last half of the 7. At the end of the 7, the Lord will return to establish his kingdom, which will be the ultimate fulfillment of Daniel's prayer. The holy people will be gathered to the land, Isaiah 43:5, and Jerusalem permanently reestablished. Daniel 10 is next.